Disclaimer. There's antimony, arsenic, and also aluminum, and hydrogen, and oxygen, and also J.K. Rowling. Chapter 2. Rita Skeeter, former gossip columnist, had decided to take some time off in the Muggle world. Well, she decided about the Muggle world part. The time off wasn't her choice. It was that little twit, Granger, who figured out she was an unregistered animagus and trapped her in a jam jar. Seriously, who carries a jam jar in her robes? But that wasn't the worst. The worst was that Granger had blackmailed her into not publishing anything for a whole year. "Little girl's going to ruin me," Rita scowled to herself. "I don't have savings for a year. And of course her parents are well-off professionals. She even gets to go to school in France. Meanwhile, I had to work for everything I got. I had to sleep in the same room as Bellatrix Black for 7 years, for Pete's sake. I'm lucky to be alive after that." Rita probably looked rather odd, grumbling to herself whilst walking into a Muggle public library. Muggles did have their uses. They had libraries everywhere, and some of their books were even useful. That was how she found out about what Granger's parents did for a living. Dentists. Muggle teeth healers. Strange, but lucrative. Also, the cost of living was lower in the Muggle world, if you played your cards right. "Well, if I can't publish for a year, I can at least research," she said. "Get something ready for my big return. Maybe even start that biography of Dumbledore I've always wanted to write. Ha! As soon as the old man kicks the bucket and can't find back, I'll be rolling in it." But Rita's project today was a little more mundane. Something Granger had said had been bugging her, no pun intended, for the past week, and she needed a Muggle library to understand it. "Now," she thought to herself, "what on earth do the words 'human rights violation' mean? I mean, it's obvious what they mean, but why do the Muggles think Azkaban is one, and why do they care so much about it?" Nastily exhausting wizarding test results. Pass grades, fail grades. Pass grades are outstanding, exceeds expectation, acceptable. Fail grades, poor, dreadful, troll. Hermione Jean Granger has achieved arithmancy O*. "Dear Miss Granger, I was most impressed 1 year ago when you achieved the highest recorded score on the current OWL examination in arithmancy. I was pleased to see that you maintained this high standard after studying just 1 year for this exam. You have achieved the highest score ever on the current version of the Newt exam that was instituted in 1950. I congratulate you again on your stellar performance. I also wish to give you early notice of a rare opportunity. The arithmancy exams, along with the rest of the OWL and Newt exams, are set to be revised during the 1998-1999 school year, to be implemented in the spring of 2000. Normally, top experts who are active in the field of each subject are invited to contribute to the revisions to ensure that students are tested on the skills they will need to succeed outside of school. Given your scores, you would certainly be qualified to help revise the OWL exam and probably the Newt as well, especially if, as I suspect you will, you obtain a mastery in the subject by that time. If you choose to continue living in Britain after your graduation from Beauxbatons, the Wizarding Examination Authority will likely contact you in the summer of '98 to join the project. You do not need to do anything now, but you may wish to pay particular attention to the arithmancy needs of the community as you continue in your studies, in order to have a better understanding going into the project. Sincerely, Griselda Marchbanks, Governor of the Wizarding Examinations Authority. Dear Harry, we're all getting settled in here. Sorry, I can't tell you where he is. Mum's looking over my shoulder to make sure I don't tell you anything I shouldn't. She seems to think my feelings for you might cloud my judgment or something. We're quite busy here, even with most of the family here, and that crazy old dog. Dad's friends are stopping by a lot, too. Mum says we'll be able to see you later in the summer, but I can't really say anything more about that. I wish I could tell you everything, but it'll have to wait till you get here. Just ignore the prophet, and don't let the Muggles get you down. Missing you, Ginny. Dear Ginny, thank you for your letter. It's good to know I'm not forgotten. I really wish you'd have told me more, but at least you wrote a longer note than Ron, or even Sirius did. Tell your mum hi for me. I heard from Hermione. I guess she won't be along till later. I hope things aren't too hard there for you. I'd like to know what's going on with you, but I especially want to know what Voldemort is doing. I've been ignoring the Prophet because they aren't reporting anything. You'd tell me if you knew something, right? It all seems too quiet around here. The Dursleys aren't being any worse than usual, which is good. You'll never believe what Dudley did, though. He actually lost weight. Apparently he started exercising and took up boxing, Muggle dueling. I hate to admit it, but he's actually good at something. I really hate to admit it, because it makes him an even bigger bully. I'm still faster than him, though. Yours truly, Harry. P.S. Do me a favor and prank Sirius and Remus for me. That boy needs to use a little more discretion, Molly Weasley said. He shouldn't be hinting about who we're staying with and why. Mom, he's bored and frustrated, Ginny said. He wants to know what's going on, and no one will tell him. I'd be mad, too, and I'll thank you not to read my personal mail over my shoulder. You heard what Professor Dumbledore said, Ginevra. Yes, owls can be intercepted, etc., etc. It's not like somebody couldn't figure this stuff out anyway. There wasn't anything secret. Just be sure it stays that way, then, Molly said. A week later, Hermione visited Cedric in the hospital again. He looked better this time. His color was back, he was wearing normal clothes, and he was sitting in a chair reading rather than in the bed. Most notably, though, he now had 4 limbs again. Hermione, it's good to see you, he said, rising to his feet as she entered the room. He stumbled slightly and grabbed the cane with his good left hand. His right leg had been severed at the hip, so no matter how good the prosthetic was, it was sure to take some getting used to. Below the cuff of his trousers, she saw a crudely carved wooden shoe that looked like it was attached to a wooden hydraulic arm, and would have had to be enchanted in some way. He gave her an awkward half-hug with a fully articulated wooden hand that moved without any visible pulley mechanism. Hi, Cedric. I'm glad to see you're back on your feet, Hermione said with a smile. Well, more or less, he said, tapping his wooden shoe with his cane. This thing is supposed to be a lot better than Moody's, but I'm not seeing it. It is? I would have thought he'd have the best that was available. No, from what I hear, Moody uses a Muggle prosthetic. He's too paranoid to get an enchanted one in case someone cancels it in a fight. As opposed to a plain wooden one where someone can just curse it off? Hermione said. Well, no one ever said he was sane, Cedric replied. The arm's no better either. I can't write with it any better than my left, but they'd say that should get better with practice. And of course you can't use a wand with it. That too, but that's why you're here, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Thank you for coming. Say, it should be time to get your newt results, shouldn't it? Didn't you take the arithmancy exam? Yes, I did, Hermione said, suppressing a smile. And? Cedric pressed. How did you do? Not how I expected. He frowned. You mean you didn't get an O? Actually, I did so well that they want me to help rewrite the exam standards, she said with a grin. Cedric's jaw dropped. Rewrite the standards, he said. Based on your test scores alone? That's incredible. When are they planning to do it? Can you do it from France? It won't be till after I graduate, so I'll be free then, unless Mum and Dad want to move to Australia or something, which might not be a bad idea under present circumstances. Australia? Hermione's mum said. Might be worth it considering you're muggles and all, Mrs. Granger, Cedric said. Still, wow, you never do anything halfway, do you? Are you kidding? Hermione lowered her voice. I need to step up my game with Voldemort back. Cedric flinched. You just know Harry's going to get tangled up with that again. I'm still going to try to help him however I can. He smiled weakly. You're a good friend, you know that? I wish there was more we could do for you. She shook her head. I keep telling Harry, just staying alive is enough for me. When you're being hunted by a madman, there's only so much else you can do. I hope I can be a better friend to you than that, Cedric told her with a frown. And I'd say the same about Harry. I know we haven't been as close lately as we used to be, but even I could see that almost every time you saw your friends up here for the past year, you were running yourself ragged trying to help Harry with the tournament. That's not exactly a healthy friendship, even if it's necessary. We were both victims of circumstance, she said. We still are, in my opinion. So much trouble in his life, especially. But I'm sure that if I ever truly needed something from him, Harry would move heaven and earth to help me. That's just the way he is. Anyway, we need to get to the lesson. Right, left-handed casting. So how do we go about this? I've never paid much attention to what hand people use. I know it's not as simple as just switching hands. You're right. I learnt it from Neville Longbottom. You might want to talk to him when school starts again, but basically there are some wand movements that transfer straight from one hand to the other, some that mirror, and a few that are completely different. I don't know if you've seen, but they make a left-handed version of the standard book... The standard book of spells. Yes, I know. Mum and Dad already bought me the full set. I looked through them, but they assume your left hand is your dominant hand, so it's a lot harder than they think for me to make the figures. I know! Not only is your right hand dominant, but you've been favouring it since you first learnt to pick up a quill. There's not a whole lot you can do besides practice a lot at every spell. Wand movements that normally take minutes to learn with your dominant hand may need hours of practice with your non-dominant hand to build up the muscle memory, especially to do them quickly. I learnt a few tricks I can show you, though. Hermione made Cedric stand with his wand in his left hand and one of her toy wands in his right hand, and made him practice simple wand movement elements, like flicks, swishes, jabs, and swirls with both at once, in parallel and mirrored. It was easier to train your hand to move properly when you tied it to the accurate movement of your right hand, or so she said, but it was more challenging for Cedric than it had been for her because he still wasn't very coordinated with his prosthetic arm. His handwriting, previously quite neat, for a boy, was now a near illegible scrawl, even worse than Harry's. We so rarely break down wand movements into individual motions, except in arithmancy, she said after they practiced for a while. But it's easier if you learn the individual movements now and string them together later. I'd recommend focusing on that for this week, and we can work on actual spells next week. I suppose so, Cedric replied, trying not to be too disappointed with his performance. He had been at the top of his class, but he was pretty sure his marks in his wand-based classes were going to suffer now, even with intensive practice. You'll do fine, Cedric, Hermione assured him. I've learnt it well enough that I can do all of the most useful spells left-handed, and that was whilst juggling a lot of other projects. If you put in the hours, you should be able to pick up your classes this autumn without much trouble. Well, thanks, Hermione, he said. I still wish I could do more, though. With Voldemort being back, Dumbledore's going to need the help he can get, even after the Ministry pulls its head out of its arse. Did you see Fudge is lobbying to have him sacked as Chief Warlock? Yes, I did. Ugh, don't get me started on Fudge. But still, I'm sure you can find something useful. We'll need more than just fighters, after all. I mean, look at me. Can you imagine me in a knockdown, drag-out fight with dark wizards? Actually, yes, Cedric said. I think you could hold your own. Hermione blushed. But before she could respond, her father spoke up. I think she'll be avoiding things like that just the same. Her parents had been quiet through most of the visit, but they had stayed and watched, mostly out of interest for the teaching process, so they were certainly paying attention. So then, when you say step up your game, what did you mean by that? Cedric wondered. Hermione glanced at her parents. Mindful that they would be concerned about what she was considering, she said, I meant inventing new curses, like I did for Harry with the tournament. Now that I've finished partial differential equations, I can make really powerful ones. Things for breaking through shields, incapacitating enemies, or otherwise hindering their spellcasting. I'll probably send them to one of Hogwarts' professors for the really serious ones, so they can decide what to do with them. That was mostly true, except that she was still intending her first point of contact to be Harry, and she wasn't going to be shy about the nastier curses. Even her teeth-drilling hex was probably something her parents would disapprove of, especially the fact that she had used it on Draco Malfoy, Hogwarts' biggest pure-blooded bigot. Mum and Dad had always been very clear that dentistry was supposed to help people, not hurt them. Cedric understood Hermione's position well enough, but he was unsure what job he could do himself in the coming war. And he had no illusions that war was coming. He definitely trusted Harry. Maybe he could be useful brewing potions or going into some other part of the healing industry. That was sure to be needed. The main other thing that came to mind was going into politics, like his father, but that was worse than useless until the Ministry admitted the truth, not to mention he had little taste for it. He had to do something, though. He hadn't actually been conscious when you-know-who had returned, but he had remembered 3 hissed words. Kill the spare! It was his father more than himself who was offended that he, at the top of his class, was called the Spare. But just the same, Cedric had a growing urge to show Voldemort just what a spare could do. He'd have to think about his options. Luckily, he had plenty of time to do it. After a little more practice, he thanked the Grangers once more, and they left, leaving him to his thoughts. Hermione had invented quite a few useful spells to help Harry survive the Triwizard Tournament last year, but by far her best work had been the spell she had cooked up for the first task. Being told Harry had to face a nesting mother dragon with just 2 days' notice, she had constructed and tested a spell to extract magnesium powder from soil in just 24 hours, and taught it and the banishing charm to Harry in the following 12, all running on nothing but pepper-up potion. When Harry walked into the arena, the fight ended with a cloud of magnesium dust exploding in the face of the Hungarian horntail like a stun grenade, causing the disoriented beast to fall on its, well, tail. That was naturally impressive, and garnered both Harry and Hermione a lot of praise, but Hermione had been fascinated by the possibilities. What other metals could she strip from the soil? It was a complicated prospect. Each element needed its own purification spell, and some of them were infeasible for no other reason than that the spell extracted them in powder form. She didn't even try for sodium. Honestly, a cloud of powdered sodium metal over damp soil? She didn't need to burn her eyebrows off again. Fortunately, simple compounds weren't much harder, and she did manage to pull off a spell to extract sodium chloride. Other elements were far too rare. Gold was present in soil, and when she got home, she constructed the spell to extract it. But when she tested it in a concealed corner of her backyard, she only got a tiny pinch of the stuff. She did a quick mental calculation and determined that she could strip mine the entire yard and only get enough for the tiniest of coins. And she thought that would be too conspicuous to try. The other problem was that the powder form was hard to handle, so over the past school year she had found ways to melt it down into solid nuggets, although for the most refractory elements she had to use thermite to do it. That was what happened to her eyebrows the first time. And there was one element, tungsten, that even thermite couldn't touch. She didn't have a need for it, yet, but she thought it might be useful for ballast or something. In any case, it was with this and other projects that Hermione busied herself over the summer. She had summer homework, of course, but she finished that quickly. Her goal was to have spells finished for all of the elements before she returned to school, and in the corner of the backyard she tested them by extracting small amounts of each element to add to her collection. Overall, she was a lot less busy now than during the school year, but Hermione Granger never really stopped. She bought a book on C, and taught herself the basics of computer programming. That would have sounded completely useless for a witch who lived for most of the year in a place with no electricity, but there were similar concepts incorporated into ancient runes that would allow her to one-up a certain pair of map-makers she knew. She got hold of a real analysis textbook from a university to continue her maths education. And, of course, she started working on new curses. She felt a bit uncomfortable about that last one. Creating really nasty spells didn't come naturally to her, but she was sure she'd need them. There were letters, of course, including a couple from her friends in France. But the letters from her closest friends left something to be desired. The Weasleys' letters were very terse, and Harry's sounded like he was getting more and more frustrated not knowing what was going on. He also never mentioned the Daily Prophet anymore, which made Hermione think he wasn't reading it, only checking for news of Voldemort. That was foolish, in her opinion. It left him unprepared for what the political state of things would be when he re-entered the magical world. Hermione was getting frustrated too, of course, but she also had a lot more to occupy her time. Harry's relatives didn't want any freakishness going on in their house. He didn't have much besides the letters and his homework, so Hermione made sure to pass along any new information she had about Cedric, the Delacours in France, Neville, and Luna. Sometimes she even had a tidbit from the Weasleys that they hadn't told him. They weren't as careful writing to her as to Harry directly. Even Ginny's letters didn't give Harry much, if she read between the lines of his, which was a shame. Hermione thought Harry and Ginny were good for each other, but this summer must surely be testing their nascent relationship. As for Hermione, well, it just wasn't the same without her friends. The same way she had felt most of last year. Even though she loved the quality time with her parents, she still found herself counting down the days until the 30th of July, when she would be able to see them again. It was the 24th of July when Harry found himself lying out in the garden listening to the news through the open window. Perhaps something Voldemort did would bleed over into the Muggle world and be covered as something strange and inexplicable. He wasn't supposed to stray from number 4 Privet Drive, where his proximity to his mother's blood relatives was supposed to protect him in some convoluted magical way he didn't really understand, but he couldn't stand to be inside the physical house any more than necessary. And for good reason. The Dursleys resented him, and he resented the Dursleys. And thus all was normal in his world. Well, except for that crack of apparition he heard earlier that Uncle Vernon had blamed him for. Harry was expected to do chores while he was with the Dursleys, and he had jumped at the chance to do the gardening. It got him out of the house. The garden was dead, of course. The uncommonly hot and dry summer had worsened into the worst drought in years, and the entire country was on water restriction, but it gave him time to think. Harry was sure he would have gone spare by now if it weren't for Dobby helping him exchange letters with Hermione. He appreciated Ginny's as well, of course, and they could even have meaningful relationship-type conversations through them. Not that either of them held with the really sappy stuff. But they didn't include the news he so craved, and could only get an inkling of from Hermione. Paradoxically, he had stopped reading The Prophet, only checking the front page to see if Voldemort's name was on it. He ignored it so successfully that he would have missed Dumbledore getting demoted from the Wizengamot if Hermione hadn't told him. He was sacked on the supposed grounds that he was too old to handle the pressure. Harry didn't understand the importance of that, but Hermione said it was bad. He was counting down the days until he could rejoin his friends, and give them a piece of his mind. 6 days to go, and a birthday party waiting at the other end. That was his great consolation in all this. Even though his godfather, Sirius Black, was giving him the silent treatment as to what he was up to, he was still promising a lavish birthday party. Actually, come to think of it, he never said birthday party. He just said party. No one had ever written a definite date when they could come get him except Hermione. It was annoying. It was hard, too. In addition to having to put up with the Dursleys, his nightmares had come practically every night this summer, taking him back to that graveyard where Voldemort had come back from the dead, Cedric Diggory nearly being killed by Barty Crouch Jr. in Harry's dreams. Sometimes he was killed, and he would wake up in a cold sweat. Sometimes he would go further back and hear his mother begging for mercy. "Oi, Runt!" Harry's thoughts were interrupted by a toad jabbing into his ribs. "Quit slacking off!" Dudley, Harry's large and annoying cousin. Harry really wanted to tell him off. He could think of so many comments he could make, but he held his tongue. He remembered the one clear command Sirius had given him for the summer. Keep your nose clean, be careful, and don't do anything rash. In other words, the exact opposite of what Sirius would have done. "Gardening's done, Big D," he said, not bothering to get up. "What did you call me?" Dudley said in surprise. "I heard your gang calling you that the other day," Harry said. He sat up part way, keeping his head below the windowsill. "When did you become Big D, anyway?" "You don't get to call me that!" Dudley snapped. Harry scrambled to his feet, one hand resting against his trouser leg where his wand was. He couldn't use it, though. He already had one black stroke on his record for Dobby's misguided attempt to save his life 3 years ago, and he'd be risking expulsion if he used magic now. But he didn't want to be in a vulnerable position around Dudley. Over the past year, Dudley had done something that Harry would have said was impossible, even with magic. Shown some self-discipline. His cousin, who had been throwing fits like a little kid over being put on a diet last summer, had not only actually lost weight, started working out, and taken up boxing, but had done well enough at all 3 of those things to become a regional junior heavyweight champion. Apparently, all those years of beating up on Harry were good practice. Harry hated to admit it, but the Dursleys were actually fairly talented. Uncle Vernon didn't get to be a director at a firm by being incompetent. Aunt Petunia was at least a good cook, what little he got to eat of it. There was a reason Vernon and Dudley were so large, and it had started long before Harry could work the stove. And then there was Dudley's boxing. When the lump actually applied himself, he could be impressive. Well, Harry supposed Petunia and Dudley couldn't have missed out on all of his mother's genes. Dudley didn't miss where Harry's hand was going. "Think you're a big man carrying that thing, don't you?" he said. Harry very nearly rose to the bait and drew his wand, but that would have been exceedingly foolish standing right in front of the Dursleys' front window. Instead, he just smiled and said, Did I tell you about the time I beat a dragon in a fight with this thing? That ought to be a trump card against Dudley's boxing. Dudley's foolhardiness was showing, though. Yeah, you talk tough, Potter, but you're not so brave at night, are you? What? Harry said in genuine confusion. I heard you moaning last night, Dudley taunted. Don't kill Cedric! Don't kill Cedric! Who's Cedric, your boyfriend? You shut up about him, Harry yelled. He did draw his wand then and pointed it at Dudley's chest. Hey, boy, you put that down! Uncle Vernon shouted, rising from his chair and barreling towards the window. Don't point that thing at me, Dudley said. Cedric fought dark wizards harder than even I could, Harry yelled. Don't you dare threaten Dudley, Vernon yelled, while Petunia screamed wordlessly. Vernon lunged out the window to grab Harry, but Harry jumped away. Don't ever talk about him again, Harry yelled. Get that thing away from... Suddenly, everything stopped. Vernon fell out of the window. Harry and the Dursleys fell silent as it felt like they'd been doused with icy water, except it wasn't nearly as pleasant as it should have been in that weather. It was as if someone had flipped a switch from blazing hot and dry in July to freezing rain in November. Even the setting sun seemed to dim as if a veil had been stretched across it. What are you doing? Dudley said in sudden fear. Stop it! It's not me. Harry spun on the spot, scanning the street and the skies. Stop that! Vernon said. He was trying to bellow, but it came out strangled and almost... Stop that! Vernon said. He was trying to bellow, but it came out strangled and almost squeaking. Stop that right now! Quit it! What are you doing? Dudley repeated. Shut up! Harry snapped. I'm trying to find... Wham! Dudley took a swing at the perceived source of the trouble and knocked Harry to the ground, knocking his glasses off and his wand from his hand. Damn it, Dudley! Harry groaned. He fumbled for his glasses in the suddenly dim sunlight. Uncle Vernon grabbed at his ankle in a rage, and he kicked him in the face. Now was not the time for subtlety. Dudley took off running. Harry managed to get his glasses back on and see what was happening, and he nearly fainted in horror. Dudley, no! You're running right at them! It didn't seem possible. He had recognized the feeling of the Dementors at once, the cold and the crushing despair, but he never imagined they would be in little whinging. It was like it was against some rule for the magical and mundane worlds to mix like that. Yet they were right there on the street and closing fast, two towering, hooded figures dressed in black so dark that they looked like holes in the world. And Dudley, the idiot, was so desperate to get away from Harry that he was running straight into their waiting mouths. You bastard freak! Vernon roared, staggering to his feet. Even in his anger he was shaking like a leaf in fear. He lunged for Harry again, but Harry had grabbed his wand and ran after his cousin. Under the circumstances, it might have been more prudent not to leave the safety of the blood wards and just leave Dudley to his fate. But, being Harry Potter, the thought never crossed his mind, and he went to save his cousin on autopilot. Dudley, stop! Don't you see them? Harry said, but it didn't look like he did. Maybe Muggles couldn't see them. Dudley collapsed just as Harry reached him. He felt the Dementor's drain increase and went weak at the knees. His stupidity at leaving the wards caught up with him, but he had to push it away. He needed to cast his Patronus while he still could, and hang the consequences. He stood over Dudley's prone form, raised his wand to the Dementors, and yelled, Expecto Patronum! A silvery wisp of vapor emitted from his wand. The Dementors came fast. They were nearly on top of him. Crap! Concentrate, he thought, but his brain was fogging up. Concentrate! They were nearly on top of him, pulling back their hoods. He was so out of practice. Hermione wouldn't have this problem. She practiced all the time. Hermione. He'd see her again in just a few days. And Ron, Ginny, the twins, Sirius, and Remus. He held onto the thought like a lifeline. Expecto Patronum! A blazing silver stag erupted from his wand and bowled over the two Dementors, first one, then the other. The cold, dark, and despair vanished almost instantly. They were thrown to the ground, from which they swooped away, bat-like, in defeat. They sped off to the north and out of sight. Harry let out a sigh of relief, although he kept a firm grip on his wand. Phew, it's all right, Dudley. They're gone. Dudley was shaking on the ground, nearly catatonic. Dudley, get up! Dudley didn't move. Harry turned him over, and he stared at him with a vacant expression. Dudley, come on. I know they didn't kiss you.
Damn it, boy, just pick him up and drag him back inside the woods.
Harry jumped and spun around, but when he saw who it was, he quickly sheathed his wand. "Mrs. Figg?" he said in confusion.
And don't put that wand away. What if they come back?
"What? You're a witch?"
I'm a squib. I'm no good against those things, let me tell you. Now quick, you need to get back inside. Oh, I'm going to kill that mundungus Fletcher.
Harry was getting more confused by the minute, but he did as she said and hefted Dudley up on his shoulder, which was no easy task. The fearless junior heavyweight boxer seemed to have lost all will to move under his own power, and he promptly vomited on the street. How could this happen? Dementors and Little Whinging? Mrs. Figg, the batty cat lady, was a squib? There was a wizard watching the house? Well, that explained the apparition he heard earlier, but why didn't he know about it before? "What the devil are you playing at?" Uncle Vernon bellowed as Harry dragged his cousin back into the house. Vernon was on his knees, struggling to find his feet. Aunt Petunia was leaning out the window, her face an unnatural gray. "What did you do to Dudley?"
"Quit your belly-aching, Dursley!" Mrs. Figg cried as she tottered behind him. "The boy just saved that great lump from Dementors. Weren't you watching?"
"Dementors?" Aunt Petunia squeaked. "What the Rudy hell are Dementoids?" Vernon demanded.
"They guard the wizard prison."
Everyone, even Dudley, even Mrs. Figg, stopped and stared at Petunia. How did she know? Yes, she was Harry's mum's sister, but she never paid attention. Harry had asked her about magic before.
"That awful boy told Lily years ago," she said, to general astonishment.
That silver thing," Vernon said, more in confusion now than anger, "that was a prison god?" "No, that was a Patronus," Harry grunted in annoyance. "It's how you fight them." He continued dragging Dudley into the house. "Come on, you'll need chocolate." Vernon goggled at the non sequitur. "Chocolate? What do you think you're doing? Now see here."
"Will you shut up, Dursley?" Mrs. Figg said. "Shut your pie-hole and listen to someone who actually knows what they're talking about."
"Figg?" he said in confusion. You're one of his lot?" Mrs. Figg hissed like one of her cats.
"Yes, I'm one of his lot. He just saved your sorry souls, so maybe show some gratitude."
But Vernon wasn't having it. "Oh no, I've had enough freakishness in my house." He managed to stagger to his feet and lay a hand on Harry's shoulder, but Harry spun around at once and pointed his wand in his face, the tip glowing. He was in no mood for this. He had just been forced to do magic and was sure to be in big trouble. "Uncle Vernon, we just got attacked by soul-sucking demons," he growled. "They came for me, but they're not picky. I bet you would have made a nice dessert for them." "You think you can make up such a cockamamie story?"
"Vernon, it's true."
Vernon deflated and turned in surprise when Petunia spoke up.
"I saw Harry out there. He was protecting our Dudley. He couldn't have done all that himself."
Harry's eyebrows shot up. He couldn't remember the last time his aunt had called him Harry, in his uncle's presence anyway. It seemed like even she could be civil if you gave her a big enough shock.
"There, listen to your wife," Mrs. Figg said. "At least someone has some sense around here. Let's move it, boy. I think I could use some chocolate myself."
Clearly outnumbered, Vernon stumbled into the house automatically, following Harry's lead for lack of anything better to do. He and Petunia sat in an uneasy silence as they tried to coax Dudley into talking again, and listened to a confused explanation of what a Dementor was and what Mrs. Figg was doing there. Surprisingly, the chocolate made them feel quite a bit better. It was an odd scene for No. 4 Privet Drive. The Dursleys were almost acting pleasant. And then the first owl flew in the door.